Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Chen. As Ryle mentioned, I'm senior producer for Kids Media and Education at WNET, which is the PBS station in New York City. And I'm joined by David Langenden from Electric Fun Stuff, also here in New York City, and Brian Nia from Densho in Seattle. And we're excited to be here to talk to you about the development of our game, Prisoner in My Homeland. So let's get started. So Prisoner in My Homeland is the sixth game from Mission US, which is our award-winning series that we developed to engage young people in transformational moments in American history. We began developing Mission US back in 2005 with the goal of getting young people to care about history by seeing it through the eyes of peers from the past. Since 2010, we've launched 6 games, each putting players in the role of a young person at a pivotal moment in US history. And each game is accompanied by a comprehensive educator guide to help support teachers in using the games in middle school classrooms. And we're thrilled that more than 3 million students and 100,000 teachers have used our games to date. So, Prisoner in My Homeland. In this game, players step into the role of Henry Tanaka. And you'll see Henry, he's on the upper right hand in this slide. Henry is a fictional Japanese-American teenager whose family is forced to leave their home for a military prison camp in Manzanar, California. In the game, players grapple with challenges faced by more than 120,000 Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated during World War II.
The year is 1941. You are Henry Tanaka, a 16-year-old American citizen. But after the US declares war on Japan, you are seen as the enemy. The government forces you and 120,000 other innocent Japanese Americans into prison camps. Will you help your community? Support the war? Resist injustice? When your loyalty is questioned, how will you respond? Mission US. Serious history, serious games.
So, creating a game designed to educate middle schoolers about difficult, complex, and often sensitive history comes with its unique challenges. And in the process of building the Mission US series over the past decade, we've developed and are continuing to refine a set of game design principles that have informed all of our missions. And today we'd like to share a little bit about how the development and design of Prisoner in My Homeland illustrates some of these principles in practice. So fundamentally, we believe that history and social studies curriculum should be inclusive and reflect diverse experiences and perspectives. The topic of the Japanese American incarceration is still not taught widely or in depth in many classrooms across the country. So we felt strongly that this mission filled a critical need and could support teachers who wish to incorporate this content into their curriculum. So fundamentally, that's why we produced this game. And from the beginning, we knew that it was critical to involve members of the Japanese American community in development of the game so that they could be active participants in telling their stories. We collaborated closely with advisors from the Bainbridge Island Japanese American community, which is an organization that represents survivors of the camps and their descendants. We also collaborated with Brian and his colleagues from Densho. And in addition, we consulted with members of the Manzanar Committee, with curriculum developers from Yuri Education Project, who helped us create a comprehensive educator's guide, as well as historians and scholars with a particular expertise in this history. Brian, would you like to talk a little bit about the role you played as an advisor?
Sure. I was, as Michelle mentioned, as one of several advisors, but I really came on later in the process after a script had been developed, and along with one other person really kind of vetted the script for historical accuracy and also for kind of historical implausibility, and also looking at kind of cultural and community factors as a Japanese American, right? How would a 60-year-old Japanese immigrant interact with a teenage American-born child in 1942? So kind of advising on those kinds of things, but at the same time recognizing that you have to take some creative license in telling a story like this, particularly for a young teenage audience. So kind of there's a back and forth that goes on between the history and the culture, and then how you handle it in a game situation. So kind of being involved in that kind of interactive process.
Thanks, Brian. And I'm going to hand it over to David.
Thanks, Michelle. So Mission US is as those of you who have played, is a story-driven experience. It's all about the narrative. So we'd already decided to focus on the Japanese American incarceration during World War II because, as Michelle said, it's sparsely covered in most history curricula, and even before the recent burst of anti-Asian discrimination, it had strong linkages to today. But we've long recognized that one game can't do justice to all the stories, themes, and perspectives that make up the lived experience during a time and space. So how do you choose a story to tell? And for us, the story we choose is initially informed by the primary sources and advisors that are available to us. We dive really deep into our content, as Brian can attest, I hope. So we need confidence that something or someone can answer most of our pretty crazy questions at times. Second, we look at it through the lens of a middle school student. How much backstory do we need to unpack? And what has the most resonant themes and details? So in Prisoner in My Homeland, we had Henry Tanaka come from Bainbridge Island, which is outside of Seattle. There's certainly were larger Japanese American communities that were incarcerated. And there were many that had a really rough or even rougher experience than the Bainbridge Islanders. But Bainbridge Island was a place that many Japanese Americans were actually able to return to after the war, and that community maintained its story. It was also home to the Bainbridge Review, a newspaper that was very sympathetic to the Japanese American plight, and they provided us a very rich archive to review and dig into. And finally, the Bainbridge Island story was the simplest setup that we found from sort of that middle school perspective, and even that for us set a new record for the length of our prologue. But even of that one story, the interactive nature of the game lets us tell many variations. What if Henry declares loyalty to the US? What if Henry refuses to serve in the armed forces? What if Henry is able to go to college? So in the classroom setting where Mission US is most played, our one story becomes 20 to 25 unique stories. Slide. In the design perspective, we have to think about a lot of sort of ranges of content and possibilities. And one thing we have to measure ourselves is how accessible as it is for middle school students. So how do you tell a story that is going to work for them? One thing that we do a lot, and that perhaps that left screenshot will hint at, is teen themes, as we call them: family, romance, aspiration, the sort of the who am I stories, self-creation. We sort of put those throughout the whole story so that kids can really relate to characters from that time and place. And see it, say, hey, I sometimes fight with my mom. This kid's fighting with his mom. It really helps them sort of feel at home in history. The other thing we do is make sure that the tasks we give the player character to do is age appropriate, and it's something that the kids will understand what to do. And but by doing those tasks in the context of the game, it exposes them to the broader political, economic, and social themes of the time. For us, shopping and laundry have been common tasks in the series, and although that sometimes sounds boring, kids love them. In Prisoner in the Homeland, Henry's actually spared the laundry. His mom and sister do it. But he has to find something to cover the holes in his barracks because the dust is blowing through. And then he also has to go to the post office to see if there's a letter from his father who's being held without any explanation in a separate facility. And as maybe that last point, the missing father in a separate facility, unknown. There's a lot of difficult and sometimes distressing topics, and that we have to cover, and a lot more difficult and distressing than that. And so there are limits in the ways that students are asked and allowed to interact for those sorts of moments. We don't give them, in those cases, a right way to play, and there's no way to win. And when we depict incidents of violence or discrimination, we weigh the needs of historical accuracy with the capacities of middle school students. When it's necessary to depict such material, it's done in a manner that's age appropriate. The most extreme historical violence occurs off-screen and is revealed to the player through dialogue or non-interactive animations, but not graphic animations, I should footnote. And students are never asked to play the role of characters who oppress others. Okay, slide. And then perhaps the trickiest thing, or one of the things that we spend the most time doing, is trying to sort of balance the needs of historical accuracy with the needs of the story. And this is often where we turn to our advisors. So up on the screen are a couple examples that we work with Brian in a lot of detail with. So I'll let him talk about those.
Yeah, so one of the central episodes in the history of Manzanar was this incident in December of 42, called at the time a riot. I think viewed today by historians as more of an uprising. Terminology, incidentally, another key issue that you're having to deal with between kind of often euphemistic terminology of the time and terminology that's preferred today. But in dealing with this incident in December of 42, I kind of advised that maybe it's best not to have Henry be a central figure in that, because it just brings in too many complicating factors. And I think instead, ultimately, we decided to go in a different direction where it's certainly present, but Henry isn't a key figure in it, and you can't tell the Manzanar story without talking about it, but not having it be central to the mission. And the other thing was I think in all of the camps that Japanese Americans were held in, the so-called loyalty questionnaire episode is central. And this is a key moment where the player playing as Henry has to make a choice as to how he or she is going to answer that question, which determines a lot of what happens subsequently. And in this case, we kind of really decided that even though it would have been very unlikely for someone from Bainbridge Island to have answered the questions in a particular way, because it's a game, you have to allow the player to make these kinds of decisions for his or herself. And so even though it may have led in some way to an outcome that may have been historically unlikely, we still, we have to allow that to happen in order for the game to really work.
Slide. Oh, yeah. And Brian teed this up perfectly. So navigating historically used vocabulary in terms of modern understanding and sensibilities has been a challenge throughout the project. I tell you, we could spend the whole session on this one point. But the short version is something like this. On the one hand, there were historically situated terms and standard usage. Brian mentioned the riot, which was used by the government, and other terms have come into being, but also internment was used euphemistically. And even though that sort of seems to have a negative connotation, it's not nearly as negative as what it really was. But if accuracy is our only goal, one would use these terms freely, but we really have to balance out how do we use historical language within the games. Because the modern responses to some of these terms can vary from a raised eyebrow to absolute outrage. So in Prisoner in My Homeland, we did have the luxury of a narrator from the present. It's the one time we did this and it really worked well, who could situate some of the terms in the present. So you can see in that screenshot, I think if you can read the caption, Maya, the narrator, is critiquing the term. They called it internment, but it was really something much worse, basically. And that really helped us ground the use of language in both ways and sort of use the historical terms, but also talk about the modern interpretation. And this is also heavily covered in the additional curriculum materials that come with the program. We also found other ways to incorporate examples of racism against Japanese Americans through displaying real newspaper headlines. I think some of them were earlier screenshots, but there were a lot of people who put signs over their houses like "Japs go home," but we didn't want to use that kind of derogatory term directed at the player. So we're really careful about having that sort of thing come directly at the player, but to see it in a primary historical document does work a lot better. Back to Michelle.
Thanks, David. So we know, of course, that learning games are most impactful when they're meaningfully integrated into a broader learning experience in the classroom. So we knew it was also very important to provide supports for teachers to help them contextualize the game within the broader history. So the educator guide for Prisoner in My Homeland includes background information, classroom activities, vocab supports, standards alignments, primary sources, all kinds of resources to help teachers promote further discussion about the broader social, political, and economic context of events and perspectives in the game, and really just to help young people make connections to the larger historical themes that remain relevant today. And in addition, we've provided professional development webinars to support teachers, and also recommendations for ensuring some safe, respectful practices in using the games in the classrooms. We really believe it's critical to teach young people about the past in order to empower them with the knowledge and understandings to improve their present. And we think it's especially critical for understanding these long-term struggles for justice and inequality that continue today. We began working on this game back in 2017, and obviously back then we couldn't have anticipated all of the events of the past year. But the rise in anti-Asian violence and racism over the past year have really shown a brighter light on these struggles in the Asian American community, and really shown how games like Prisoner in My Homeland have been relevant long before and will likely continue to be even after this year has passed. So I wanted to close on a quote from Lily Kodama, one of our advisors on the project from Bainbridge Island. And I'll just read it to you. I'm 86 years old and have lived the games event. I played it with my 17-year-old granddaughter. We were both quite impressed with how well all events were covered in a way that young people can learn this part of rarely told American history in an easy and enjoyable way. This is so important for all to know how righteous governments and people can make wrong, dishonorable decisions based on fear and poor leadership. I do not want this to happen again to any other group. So I think this really encapsulates a lot of our mission behind creating this game, and why it was so important for us to work with members of the community to tell this story and help them tell their story. And it was a privilege really for us to be able to be welcomed to Bainbridge Island, to meet all of these advisors and hear their stories and have them share their own personal lived experiences with us. And if you do play the game, which we hope you will, you may notice that there is a character who bears a resemblance to Lily, even has the same name, but with one fewer L. Lily herself was a young girl at Manzanar, and so there is a character in the game that we've modeled loosely on Lily. So I just want to give a quick shout out to all of our funders for Mission US, and especially to thank the National Park Service Japanese American Confinement Sites program that made this game possible. They provided a lot of support and really helped us, helped motivate actually also the creation of this game. So thank you to them and to all the rest of our funders. And here is where you can find us. All the games are available for free, as well as the educator materials at missionus.org. You can find us on social media, email us. We'd love to hear from you. And we're looking forward to answering your questions in the Q&A, which I believe will be in the Spark Q&A room. And I think someone is going to be putting a link in the chat if they haven't already done so. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you over in the Q&A.